Welcome to Understanding Perspectives. On today's episode, I'm going to be talking about a specific example of how a translation can be the subtlest form of interpretation. If you're not a Hebrew or a Greek speaker, then when you read the Bible in English or whatever other language you might be reading it in, you're going to have to some degree, trust what the translators are telling you that the original text said, because they're going to have to be making choices about how to translate it. And that's why you're going to have, if you look at different translations, you'll have subtle differences between them. And sometimes the differences can be significant in terms of what the verse seems to mean. And so the reason this is that there are differences in the way that languages work, and there are sometimes words in the source language that are ambiguous, and so you could translate them with multiple different English or other words in other languages that, depending on the context, would actually be appropriate. Instead of always translating it in the same way, it might really be legitimate to translate it in different ways in different places. Conversely, if you have multiple words in the source language that can be translated by the same word in English, or multiple words that can be translated by different words in English, you can have confusion on the part of the reader because of these differences. And depending on how that the translator decided to render these, they can influence, either on purpose or by accident, what your interpretation of the Bible is about a particular subject. And so in this case, I want to talk about the word hell, and how that there are 4 different words in the Bible, 1 Hebrew word and 3 Greek words, that are all translated hell at least some of the time, and they're translated to other words other times. So I'm going to start with the word Tartarus, which is used in 2 Peter 2:4, and it's the only time that it's used in the Bible. And I'll just go ahead and read the verse. It said, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, or Tartarus, and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment." Okay, so this word, because it is only ever used of angels, if you know that, then this verse can be discarded, if you will, in terms of trying to establish what it is that happens to people after the judgment. Because it doesn't tell us anything about people, it only tells us about angels. So while it has value for knowing what we're going to think about angels, and that they're in this place, and that they're in gloomy darkness being kept until judgment, that doesn't tell us about anything that happens to people. And so we go back to the Old Testament now and read Psalm 16:10. It says, "For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, or let your Holy One see corruption." This word Sheol is, sometimes it's left untranslated, such as in this translation, so it's just the name of the place. But in other translations that would say hell, or the grave, or the pit, or the realm of the dead, something like that. This verse is quoted in Acts 2:27. It says, "For you will not abandon my soul to Hades, or let your Holy One see corruption." And so because this is the quotation of one Hebrew text in a Greek text, and we can see that Hades is the Greek word that was used to translate the Hebrew word Sheol into Greek, we can know with some confidence, I think, that Hades is talking about the same place as Sheol. So these are not 2 different things, they're talking about the same thing. And so if we look in the Old Testament, because there's a lot more times in the Old Testament that the word Sheol is used and the word Hades is used in the New Testament. So if we look in the Old Testament, that can help inform us about what this place is and who goes there. So with regard to who goes there, at least prior to the time that Jesus died and was resurrected, both the wicked and the righteous went to Sheol. So in Genesis 37:35, it says, "All his sons and daughters came to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So his father wept for him. This is an account of Jacob, then known as Israel, who was mourning the death of his son Joseph, because his brothers told their dad that he had died. And so Israel's anticipation was that he was going to go down to Sheol, to the grave, to hell, and be with Joseph where he was. Okay, so this, whatever we think about Sheol, whether it's the grave, like a physical grave, or whether it's just the place where the dead people go, or whether we think of it as hell, whatever we think of it, it's the place where righteous people go, or at least went. Some people think something different is going on now after the resurrection. I'm not going to be discussing that. All right, so in Psalm 9:17, it says, "The wicked shall return to Sheol, all the nations that forget God." Now this is talking about the same, this is the same Sheol, right? So this is also where the wicked go specifically. So the wicked and the righteous, at least at one time, both went to Sheol. Okay. Now I'm going to read Luke 16:22-24, which says, "The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side." This is talking about Lazarus. It says, "The rich man also died and was buried, and in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, 'Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame.'" Okay, so now this passage is also, in most translations, it says that he was in hell. This translation, the ESV, renders it as Hades. It doesn't translate the word. And so a lot of people think that this is the place of the final judgment, right? After the resurrection and the righteous and the wicked are judged, that this is where the wicked are cast, because it talks about being in torment and flames. But it's talking about Hades. This is the same place where the righteous go. And actually, Abraham and Lazarus were there in this same place. Now, they were across the chasm in the story that Jesus was telling, but they were both in this place called Hades. Now, Abraham and Lazarus were receiving comfort, while the rich man, who had been wicked in his life, was being tormented. So whatever we want to say about this passage and however we want to understand it, this is not the place of the final judgment. This is the interim state. This is after death, but prior to the resurrection, because this is where everybody goes until then. So let me now move on to the last word that is translated as hell, and this is the word Gehenna. Jesus is the only person in the Bible that uses this word, or that is recorded in the Bible as using this word, except for James. And James is using it in a very different context that doesn't really apply to the judgment. But Jesus says in Matthew 18:9, if your eye causes you to sin, poke it out and get rid of it. You'll be better off to go into life with only one eye than have two eyes and be thrown into the fires of hell. And this is Gehenna, which means it's actually, if I'm understanding correctly, it was a way of pronouncing the valley, what the Hebrew term, the Valley of Hinnom, in Greek. So like today, we say the word Christ, and that is a word that is an anglicized version of the word Christos, which is the Greek word for the anointed or the Messiah. Messiah was the Hebrew word. So Christos was the translated word into Greek from the word Messiah in Hebrew, or Mashiach, however they pronounce it in Hebrew. And Christ is the anglicized, not translated version of Christos, right? And so Gehenna is, if I think this is right, that it is the Greekicized, if that's even a word, version of the Valley of Hinnom. It just means the Valley of Hinnom. This is the place in the Old Testament where a lot of the child sacrifice was done, when you had people burning their children and offering up to the pagan god Moloch. And so this is the place that Jesus references that you'll be thrown into the fires of hell if you, fail to repent. And this is, I think, the word that does refer to the place where the wicked go at the final judgment. And I think it's associated with or parallel to the lake of fire that talks about in Revelation 20, verse 10. But I'm going to read Revelation 20, verses 13 to 14 now. It says, and the sea gave up the dead who were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. So the reason I read this verse is because it talks about Hades being thrown into the lake of fire. So Hades is the same place as Sheol, where people are held, both righteous and wicked, until the judgment. And so Hades is emptied out, right? It says that death and Hades gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them according to what they had done. And then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. So Hades is different from the lake of fire, or from Gehenna, because it's actually thrown into the other one. So however you want to think about that as a literal or metaphorical thing, it's clear that they're two distinct things. I just think it's important to notice that these are not all talking about the same thing. And so if you understand that, then when you approach these things, you can see that a lot of times in the Old Testament, at least, especially in the King James Version, you'll see that when it's talking about the righteous being dead and going to Sheol, that very often it talks about them being in the pit and the grave, things like that. Whereas if it's talking about the wicked, it usually translates it as hell. And so I think this causes confusion, because you think that all over the place in the Old Testament that it's telling that the wicked are going to be in this Gehenna place, and ultimately that's true, but it's actually talking about their interim destination. And so specifically because this relates to the Luke 16 story about Lazarus and the rich man, and the confusion that exists there about what place that's talking about, a lot of people get the idea that because the rich man was being tormented during the interim state, that he was going to therefore be tormented forever and ever in hell, in Gehenna, in the lake of fire. And however we want to interpret that, we just need to know that that's talking about two different places. And the duration that is in view needs to be considered separately from what happens in the interim state. So hopefully that makes sense, and it was helpful. And I've got other videos about this that help clarify what the different views are, whether you're talking about eternal conscious torture or conditional immortality, or I even have some talk about universalism, though I don't have much of that because I don't know a whole lot about universalism. I don't find much evidence in the Bible for this. I don't think it's the right view, but I think the other two are much more well represented in the scripture. At least there are verses that sound like both of the other two, and deciding between those, I think, is really the task that we need to face if we're talking about the eternal fate of the wicked. And so I just want to try and help everybody see more clearly what is really going on, so that, and at least understand what the issues are, so that you can make up your own mind what you think about this. Thanks for your attention. May God bless you.